My name is Dorothée Vaillant, and I am 79 years old, and I am recording this on the 14th of March, in the year 2003, because my brother Fernand died 6 weeks ago, and the promise I made him in the spring of 1962 has died with him. He was the last one still alive who knew. He was the last one I had to protect by keeping silent. And now I am sitting at the kitchen table of the house where we grew up, in the Abitibi, with a borrowed tape recorder that belongs to my granddaughter Sylvie. And I am going to tell the truth about what happened to our father in January of 1961 and about what brought him home. I should say this first. I am not a woman given to invention. I spent 31 years as a district nurse in the Harricana Valley, delivering children in farmhouses and trappers' cabins, and twice in the cabs of stop trucks. And in 31 years, I never wrote anything in a report that I had not observed with my own eyes, or heard from a reliable witness with her hand on a Bible. That is not piety. That is the only discipline that matters when other people's lives depend on what you write down. My father was the same kind of person. He was Gustave Vaillant, and he trapped the territory north of Amos for 22 years. And he was a man who did not exaggerate. And he was also a man who came home from the bush in February of 1961 with frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand and 2 toes on his right foot, and a story that he told only to my mother and eventually to me, and that my mother told to Fernand and to no one else in this world. I am going to tell it now. I am going to get it right. My father left for his trapline on the 7th of January 1961. This was normal. He had been making that trip for more than 2 decades, alone or sometimes with another man. And in January of 61 he went alone because his usual partner, a man named Hormidas Belial, had broken his collarbone the previous autumn and could not travel. The territory my father worked was north and slightly east of Amos, in the country above the Ville-Montel River, 80 kilometers of boreal forest, that he knew the way a woman knows the rooms of her own house in the dark. He carried a sled loaded with traps and provisions. He had 3 dogs, and he expected to be back by the 1st of February, or shortly after, depending on the weather and the catch. He did not come back by the 1st of February. My mother, whose name was Marguerite, was not yet afraid by the 5th of February. She had known my father a long time, and she knew the bush held him sometimes, and he could not always move when he wanted to. She became afraid on the 10th of February when a man from the provincial game office came to the door and told her that a pilot flying a supply run to a camp near Matagami had spotted what appeared to be an abandoned sled and the carcass of at least 1 dog on the ice of a small unnamed lake, 50 kilometers north of where my father's first cabin stood. The game office man was apologetic and careful with his words, and my mother stood in the doorway in her apron and listened to him. And when he was finished, she said, very quietly, that she understood, and she closed the door, and she sat down at this same kitchen table, and she did not move for a long time. I was 17 years old. Fernand was 14. We sat with her. The search that went out in the 3rd week of February found the sled. They found 2 of the 3 dogs dead, and they found the 3rd dog, a young male named Sipaya, alive but thin and badly frightened, tied to a tree several hundred meters from the lake, with a full day's worth of provisions cached beside him, in a manner my father did not remember making. They found no sign of my father. They found tracks in the old snow that the searchers could not identify. and about which the man who led the search, a provincial officer named Gaston Labrec, said only that they were large and that he had no explanation for them. And then he said nothing further. My father came home on the 22nd of February. He walked up the road from the direction of town in the late afternoon, in the last grey light of a winter day, without his sled, without the 2 dead dogs, without most of his equipment, wearing his own coat and boots, but also a kind of wrapping around his torso and legs that my mother said looked like strips of bark and woven root, fibre-bound with something she could not identify. He was thin. He had lost, by the doctor's estimate at the hospital in Amos, somewhere between 25 and 30 pounds. His beard had grown for weeks. His left hand was wrapped in a cloth, and 2 of those fingers were black at the tips. When the doctor unwrapped his right foot, 2 toes on that foot were also damaged, though not so badly that they were lost. He had a confusion on the side of his head from a fall, healed by then into a yellow bruise. He was alive. He was, except for the frostbite, which the doctor said was old, meaning it had happened weeks before, essentially whole. He told the doctor that he had fallen through the ice of a creek in a place he did not recognize, that he had lost his bearings afterward from the cold and the confusion on his head, and that he had wandered, and that he did not remember all of it clearly. The doctor wrote this down. Gaston Labrec came to the hospital and wrote it down also. My father signed the statement. He was very calm throughout this. He answered every question they put to him in the same measured, slightly flat voice that he used when he was being precise about something, and my mother sat beside his bed and held his wrapped hand and did not look at anyone else in the room. He did not tell the doctor or Gaston Labrec how far he had been carried. He did not tell them what had carried him. He told my mother that night, after Fernand and I had been sent to the hotel down the road from the hospital with money for supper and strict instructions not to come back before 8 o'clock. He told her in a low voice in the hospital room with the door pulled to, and she sat very still while he spoke, and she did not interrupt him, and when he was finished, she sat a while longer without saying anything, and then she took his damaged hand very carefully in both of hers, and she said, in a voice my father described as the quietest he had ever heard her use, that she believed him and that it would stay between them. He told me in the autumn of 1962, sitting on the back steps of this house, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, because I had asked him directly. I was 18 by then. I had spent a year watching him, in a way I had not watched him before, noting small things. The way he sometimes stopped working and looked north, not with the unfocused look of a man resting, but with the specific, attending look of a man who expected something. The way he kept Sipila close to him now, when he would before have let the dog range freely. The way he had stopped drinking entirely, not dramatically, but simply and without announcement, as though he had decided that whatever he had to carry from now on, he wanted to carry with full clarity. I noticed these things and I thought about them for a year, and then I sat down beside him on the back steps on a cool September evening, and I said, "Papa, tell me what happened out there. Tell me all of it." And he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, in exactly the voice I have been describing to you, the voice of a man who wants to get something exactly right. "I will," he said. "I will tell you. What happened was this. On the 15th of January, 1961, my father was running a line of marten traps along a creek that fed the Villemontel from the north, moving quickly because the temperature had dropped. to somewhere he estimated at -35 Celsius, and dropping further when a thin section of ice over a deeper pool gave way under him without warning. He went into the waist. He got out. This is a thing that can be survived if a man acts fast and correctly. And my father knew how to act, and he stripped the wet layers from his lower body immediately, and wrung them, and put them back on, and began moving. But the temperature was what it was, and the damage was already done, before he had his dry underlayer over the wet, and he knew as he walked that his feet were in trouble. He made it back to his nearest cache, which was roughly 4 kilometers from where he went in, and he got a fire going and treated the feet as well as he could and rested one day. But the cache was not a full cabin, only a rough lean-to with a cache box, and he could not stay. He needed to reach the first cabin, which was another 11 kilometers southeast, and he started out the following morning, and he had gone perhaps 3 kilometers when the confusion began. He was not sure if he struck his head on something, or if it was the cold and the exhaustion acting together. He remembered stopping to rest against a spruce, and then the light was wrong, lower and greyer, and he was not where he had been resting, and he did not know how much time had passed. The compass was in his coat pocket. He took it out, and it told him south, and he started walking south. But the country did not look right to him, and after a time he understood that he had gone in the wrong direction while he was confused, and he did not know by how much. He kept walking south by the compass. The temperature did not rise. He made a small fire at dark, not enough to be warm, but enough to keep him alive, and the next morning he continued south. But south was not bringing him to anything he recognized, and by the third day he understood that he was in serious trouble. The dogs had followed him from the creek. Sipile and the 2 older ones, a male named Grisou and a female named Noirette, had stayed with him through the first days. On the morning of the 4th day, he woke from a shallow sleep against the roots of a fallen spruce, and Grisou was dead beside him, curled up, having simply stopped in the night. He did not have the strength to do what he would otherwise have done for the dog. He rose and walked. Noirette lasted 2 more days, and then she too was gone, and it was only Sipile who remained, the youngest, pressing against his legs at night and moving when he moved. And my father told me he spoke to that dog every day of those weeks, not out of sentiment, but because the sound of his own voice was the only evidence he could produce that he was still a reasoning man. He does not know exactly how many days he was walking before the night when everything changed. He believed it was somewhere between 8 and 12 days, from the moment he fell through the ice. He had lost count of days, because there had been 2 or 3 periods of unconsciousness that might have spanned hours or full days, and he was navigating by compass and by the position of the sun when it was visible, but he was no longer certain whether south was taking him toward the road or further from it. And the country was entirely unknown to him, high spruce plateau with no landmarks he could name. On the night in question, it was very cold. He had made a fire of sorts in the shelter of a deadfall, and he was conscious, but not, he told me, fully in possession of his thoughts. Sipile was beside him, pressed close, and the dog was the one who heard it first, because Sipile raised his head and then stood, which was a thing the dog did not do at night, and my father turned and looked in the direction the dog was looking. He said it was standing at the edge of the firelight. He paused when he said this, and I waited, and then he continued. It was standing at the edge of the firelight, and it was very large, and it was watching him. He said the word very large is not sufficient, but it is the closest word he had. It was upright, on two legs, and broad across the shoulders in a way that was more than the shadow and the light, and its face was dark, and its eyes caught the firelight and returned it to him steadily, the way an animal's eyes do in the dark, and he understood that it had been standing there, watching him for some time, before Sipaile had heard it, because there was a quality of patience in its stillness that is not the stillness of something that has just arrived. He was afraid. He told me this plainly. He was a man who had spent 22 years in the boreal forest, who had been close to bears, and once to a wolf pack, and once to something in the dark he had chosen not to pursue a second look at, and he was afraid in a way he could not account for by the usual categories of danger. And then Sipaile, he said, did a thing that changed what he understood about the moment. Sipaile walked forward 3 or 4 steps toward the thing at the edge of the firelight, and the dog was not growling, and the dog's hackles were not up, and Sipaile simply stood there, looking at the large figure, the way a dog looks at something it has decided is not a threat. And my father watched this, and the fear changed in him. It did not leave, he said, but it changed into something else. He said it changed into a kind of attention, the same kind of attention he brought to any phenomenon in the bush that he did not have a category for yet. The figure at the edge of the firelight stood for a long time. Then it moved, and it circled around the deadfall in a wide arc and came to the other side of my father's fire. Still in the dark, still at the edge, and it crouched down there on its haunches the way a man might crouch, to look at something on the ground. And it was still watching him. My father said that the eyes were the most coherent thing about the whole encounter. They were calm, and they were attentive, and they were looking at him the way a thinking being looks at another thinking being, with recognition rather than simple awareness. He said this carefully. He was not a man who used words like recognition loosely. He fell asleep. He did not mean to, and was ashamed of it when he told me, the body having simply quit on him, and when he woke in the thin light of early morning the fire was out, and Sipe was asleep against his leg, and there was no sign of the figure. He tried to rise and could not. The frostbite in his feet had advanced considerably during the night, and he could not put weight on the right foot at all, and the left was not much better, and he lay back against the deadfall and understood, in a way that was not panic but was very clear, that he would not be walking out. He was too far from anything, too damaged and too depleted, and the temperature was still brutal, and Sipaile pressed against his side, but a dog's warmth is not enough. He said he did not pray, not because he had lost his faith, but because he had a sense, which he could not explain, that the situation was not over, that there was something more to it. The figure came back before the morning light had fully arrived. It came back from the same direction it had retreated toward, and it came without sound, which is a thing that matters in the bush, because nothing that large should be able to move in dry, cold season snow without sound. And yet my father heard nothing until Sipaile stirred again, and then it was simply there, at the edge of his vision, and this time it came closer. It came to within a few meters of him, and it crouched down again, and it looked at him and at his feet, which were exposed where the wrappings had loosened in the night. And my father lay still and let it look, because there was nothing else to do, and because Sipaile was calm. What happened next my father described, with the same careful precision he used for everything else. and I have thought about this part for 40 years, and I have no other words for it than the ones he used, so I will use them. The figure reached out one hand toward my father's wrapped foot, not touching, hovering, and it made a sound, low and sustained, a sound my father said was unlike anything he could compare it to, not a vocalization in any language or in any category he had for animal sound, but a sound that carried what he could only call weight, as though the sound had something in it beyond sound. And then it withdrew the hand, and it stood up to its full height, and it looked at him for another long moment, and then it moved away into the dark line of the spruce and was gone. My father did not know what to expect after that. He pulled the wrappings back around his feet, and he got Sipile close, and he waited. By midday, something had happened that he still could not fully explain when he told me about it a year and a half later. He became aware, gradually, that he was being moved. Not by his own effort. He was lying on his back, and there was a surface beneath him that was not the ground, something flat and solid, and he was moving through the trees. And when he turned his head, he could see the tops of the spruce moving against the sky, at a pace that was not his pace, and Sipali was beside him, trotting, and when he lifted his head he could see, at the edge of his vision, the figure. It was pulling him, pulling the surface he lay on, moving through the snow without the effort that ought to have accompanied, moving a grown man's weight, moving steadily and without apparent strain, and my father lay back and looked at the sky moving above him, and he felt something he told me he would spend a long time afterward trying to name. He said it was something like being tended to. He said it was something like the feeling of waking in a bed, where the covers had been pulled around you by someone who knew you needed them. He could not maintain consciousness continuously through what followed. He came in and out. He remembered the light changing, the angle of it telling him they had travelled some hours, and then more hours, and then the light was going. He remembered stopping once, for a long period, in a dense stand of spruce, and the figure crouching over him, and the low sustained sound again, and warmth which he could not account for. He remembered Sipile eating something. He remembered waking once to full dark and stars, and the motion continuing. He tried once to speak, to say something to the figure, and the figure paused and turned its head toward him, and looked at him with those calm, attentive eyes, and he found he could not make words, and so he said nothing. He did not know how many hours. He did not know how many kilometers. What he knew when he finally came to full consciousness was that the motion had stopped, and that there was light ahead of him, yellow and warm, and that it was the light of a window. I do not know what that moment was like for him. He told me what he saw: a small cabin set in a clearing with a lit window and smoke coming from the chimney, and the figure standing a few meters away from him, no longer moving, simply standing and looking at the cabin, and then looking at my father. Sipee was sitting at my father's hip. The night was very cold and very clear and full of stars. My father lay on the surface the figure had made, and he looked up at the figure, which was close enough, now that he could see it more clearly than he had seen it before. The face in the reflected light from the window, the broad, quiet eyes, the stillness. He said the stillness was the most remarkable thing, not the size, not the dark fur, not the impossible physical fact of what had just occurred. The stillness, he said, was what he would carry with him, the quality of a being that had done what it meant to do, and was now waiting with perfect patience for something to complete itself. He said he raised his hand. His left hand, the damaged one. He raised it from where it lay on his chest, and he held it up toward the figure, and the figure looked at it, and then looked at his face. And then it turned and walked back into the dark line of the trees and was gone. A trapper named Edouard Messier lived in that cabin. He was 53 years old, a bachelor, a man of few words, who had trapped that same territory for 20 years and had a reputation for being dependable and private. He heard Sipai scratch at the door and opened it and found my father on his threshold and brought him inside. He treated the frostbite as best he could and fed him broth and kept him warm for 3 days before the weather allowed him to get him out on a borrowed snowmobile to the road, and from there to Amos and the hospital. He asked my father no questions about how he had come to be on his doorstep. My father told me that Mercier had looked at the tracks in the snow around the cabin the morning after my father arrived, and had stood looking at them for a long time without speaking, and then had gone inside and made coffee and never spoke of them again. Edouard Messier died in the winter of 1974 of a heart attack alone in that same cabin. He had kept whatever he knew to himself until then, and he kept it to himself after, which is to say, he kept it permanently. My father returned to his trapline the following January. I did not know this until later, until after I had grown enough to understand what it meant. He went back to the same territory, north of the Villa Montel, and he set his traps and ran his lines as he always had, and he was gone for the usual weeks, and when he came back he was changed in a way that was hard to name. He was quieter, and there was something in his quietness that was not the quietness of a man who has suffered or been frightened, but the quietness of a man who has received something he does not yet know how to hold correctly, and who is being careful with it until he does. He went back every year after that. He never told Fernand or me more than the single telling on the back steps, not directly, not in words, but I watched him over the years, and I came to understand certain things without being told. I understood that whatever had begun on that January night in '61 had not ended with the delivery to Edouard Mercier's cabin. I understood that the territory he trapped was now, in some way I cannot explain with the precision I prefer, a shared territory. I understood that the 3 dogs he worked with after Sipaili aged out were all, without exception, calm animals, not hunters in the usual sense, animals he had selected for a quality of temperament that is difficult to name, and that the farmers in the valley would not necessarily have called a virtue in a working dog. I understood that the cash he kept at his nearest lean-to was always provisioned with somewhat more than he needed for himself. I did not ask him about these things. We had an understanding, my father and I, that was built over years, and was not based on conversation, but on observation and on a shared sense of what required speech and what did not. I will tell you, though, what I saw when he came back each February, because that is testimony and not speculation. He came back different each year, not in the way of a man diminished by the cold, but in the way of a man who has been in the company of something demanding and has risen to meet it. There was a quality of attention in him in the weeks after his return that was unlike his ordinary attention, finer-grained, as though he were still registering details, the way you register details when something matters enormously, and you are trying to hold the whole of it. He would sit at the table after supper and look at his hands, the left one with its 2 shortened fingers, and turn them over slowly, and my mother would watch him from the far end of the table and something would pass between them that had no words attached to it, and needed none. I learned, in those years, what it looks like when two people share a weight that has become, over time, a kind of ballast rather than a burden. The weight did not press them down. It steadied them. He said one thing to me on the occasion of my oldest son's baptism in the summer of 1967 that I have kept close to me ever since. We were standing outside the church in Amos after the service, and he was holding my son, who had fallen asleep in his grandfather's arms, and my father looked at the child for a long time, and then said, without looking at me, in the considering tone he used when he was completing a thought he had been working on for some time. "There are things that live in this world that are not ours to explain," he said. "There are things that live in this world that are not ours to explain, and the right response to them is not explanation. It is gratitude." And then he handed my son back to me and walked over to speak to the priest, and that was all. He died in June of 1988 of a stroke, at home in this house, in his own bed in the night, without waking my mother. He was 71 years old. He had trapped the territory north of the Villa Montel until the winter of 1985, when his knees finally refused the snowshoe travel, and he had spent the last 3 years of his life in this house and in the garden, and sitting on those same back steps with his coffee going cold, looking north. My mother lived until 1996. She was the keeper of this between the two of them. My father had the experience, and she had the guardianship of it, which is not the same thing, but is equally important. In the months before she died, she talked about it more than she ever had before, not to me but to Fernand, who sat with her those last months, in the way that a youngest child sometimes can, and who carried what she told him with the same seriousness she had brought to it, and that my father had brought to it, and that I have, I hope, brought to it in my time. Fernand and I talked about it, the two of us, in the years after our mother was gone. Not often. We were both older, and we had both had long lives in which to think about what our father had told me on those back steps, and what our mother had kept for 37 years, and what Edouard Mercier had looked at in the snow that morning, and then turned away from, and never spoken of again. We had different ways of holding it. Fernand was the more devout of the two of us, and he held it close to his faith, not in a doctrinal way, but in the way that a person holds something that has enlarged their sense of what is possible. I held it the way I hold most things I cannot explain. As a fact I have not yet found the right category for, and so I keep it intact and do not force it into any category that would require me to reduce it. I held it that way, and I held it quietly for all of these years. I will tell you what that was like, because it is part of the record, and it ought to be said. I was a district nurse for 31 years. I delivered 214 children in that valley, and I sat with 11 people as they died, and I wrote my reports carefully and accurately, and I never put a word into a report that I could not stand behind. Alongside all of that, running beneath it like a second river beneath the ice, I carried this. It was not a burden in the way people mean when they say they carry something. It was more like carrying a very fine and fragile instrument that you have been trusted with. And so you are careful on rough ground, and you hold it close when the weather is bad, and over time you stop thinking of it as separate from yourself, and it simply becomes part of the way you move through the world. I kept it from my husband, who was a good man and would have believed me and would have been unable to resist telling someone because that was his nature. I kept it from my children, who were young and would have asked questions I could not answer. I kept it from the colleagues I worked alongside for decades, the other nurses, the doctors, the priest in Villemontel, who was the only man in the valley I might have trusted with it. But even him I chose not to tell, because a secret shared is a secret changed, and I wanted to keep it intact, the way my father had kept it, the full weight of it undiluted. But Fernand is gone now. He died on the 28th of January, 6 weeks ago, and the last person who knew is me, and I am 79 years old. And Sylvie asked me, before she lent me the recorder, gently, the way she asks things, whether there was anything I wanted to say into it that should not be lost. She did not know what I meant to say. She thought I meant family history, perhaps the ordinary kind. She was not wrong, exactly. I have been sitting at this table for some time now, with the tape turning, and I want to say clearly the things I came here to say. My father, Gustave Vaillant, fell through the ice of a creek north of the Villemontel River on the 15th of January, 1961. He was badly frostbitten and lost, and he was found in the deep bush by something he could not name, something large and dark and upright and profoundly unhurried in its regard for him, and that thing carried him on a surface it constructed for what my father estimated at between 35 and 45 kilometers, over at least one full night and into a second day, until he was brought to the lit window of a cabin where another man could help him. It then stood in the dark and watched him raise his damaged hand, and turned and walked back into the trees, and was gone. He went back to that territory every January for 24 more years. I do not know what happened in those years, out there in the country above the river. I have my own ideas, built up over a lifetime of watching my father and thinking about what he told me, but they are ideas, not testimony, and I have spent my professional life being careful about the difference. What I know is what he told me and what I observed. He was a precise man. He did not invent and he did not embellish, and the story he told me in September of 1962 on the back steps of this house was the same story he would have told you, and it was true. I want to say one more thing. In the spring of 1985, the last spring my father went out to his lines, my son Michel drove him up to the trailhead north of Amos and helped him get his sled loaded, and he told Michel before he started north that this would be the last time. He said it without sadness. My son told me this months later, when my father had confirmed it and come home from that last season. I asked Michel what my father's face had looked like when he said it, and Michel thought about it for a moment and then said, "Peaceful," he said. He said peaceful, like a man who has finished something correctly, not like a man who is losing something, like a man who has done the whole of a thing. That is what I wanted this recorder to have. The whole of it, the true shape of it, beginning to end, so that it is not lost. My father carried it quietly for 27 years, and my mother kept it for 30. 7, and Fernan carried it at the end, and now I am putting it down here, in this kitchen, at this table, and I am trusting that what was true in the country, above the Villemontel River in January of 1961, is still true now, whether anyone else knows it or not. The road outside goes quiet in the evenings. I can hear the trees from here, the stand of spruce my father planted along the north edge of the property when Fernand and I were children, and in the night, sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear them moving, and I think about him out there in that territory, running his lines, looking north on the back steps in the evening with his coffee. And I think about the thing that found him when he was past, finding himself and brought him back to a lit window, and I do not wonder at it the way I once did. I have had a long time to stop wondering and to simply be glad. He came home. He came home because something in that forest, in that cold, decided that he should, and it carried him, and it set him down at a place with light and warmth and smoke, and it waited until it was sure he would be found, and then it walked back into the dark, and whatever it was, or wherever it came from, or why it chose to do what it did, I cannot tell you. I do not know. No one knows. But I am glad. I have been glad for 42 years, and I will be glad until I am done.